Hey everybody, sorry for the delayed response there. Having a couple technical difficulties behind the scene, but it's okay. It's only 2018 and we'll figure out PowerPoint. So, thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon for the webinar on culture versus competency. So, here's a couple things we're going to go over other than the fact that I'm having a couple technical issues. Some housekeeping items for the audience today. You're in listen-only mode, meaning that you can hear me and you're going to be able to hear our presenters, but they can't hear you. So we really encourage you to utilize your control panel to ask questions and also follow along online. We will be live tweeting during the webinar using the hashtag #RDaily, and you can submit questions there as well. And just a friendly reminder that we're recording, so if for some reason you can't make it for the full webinar, no worries. We're going to be sending a follow-up email after we're done today with a copy of the recording, the presentation, and a special offer from our sponsor today. Our sponsor today is Good&Co, and I'm actually going to hand it over to my good friend William Tincup to give you a little rundown on our friends at Good&Co before we jump into things.
Sure. Thanks, Lex. And I'm sorry you're having technical difficulties. Good&Co is the sponsor of our webinar, but I've known Good&Co for a number of years now. And they're a great company, well-run company. They have a B2C kind of a play, but they also have a B2B play. And they're wanting to climb into the enterprise and do good work for businesses. In terms of this webinar and where this came from, this, I guess the genesis of this discussion is when you talk to HR and you talk to recruiters as much as we do at Recruiting Daily, you find kind of camps of people that have strongly held beliefs around culture or competence. And I think we all kind of know that, instead of it being a Rubik's Cube, or linear in some way, it's probably a combination of a lot of things. But you start somewhere. You start when you look at the resume, you start somewhere. When you're in the interview, you start somewhere. So what we really want to do, given the spirit of all of the politics that we're ingesting in these next 10 days or so, the town hall meetings, the debates, the political ads, and all that stuff. We wanted Samar and Tim to really kind of take positions. So this is going to be kind of different than our kind of a normal webinar for Recruiting Daily. We're actually going to have a debate, and we're going to run it like a debate. And we're going to have, we flipped a coin. Tim's going to go first and have a kind of his moment to kind of make his case for competency first. And then we'll let Samar respond to that, and then we'll let Samar have the floor, and then he will then make his case, and then Tim will be able to go and respond to that, and then we'll go from take questions, and at the very end, just like in your political debates, each person will then have kind of 3 minutes to wrap up and make the final case for what they believe, and they're trying to convince you. So now, as the audience, you have a different role other than just kind of listening and learning and those types of things. These two gentlemen are trying to convince you of changing your mind or potentially validating the way that you believe. So kind of take that into account as they talk. They're trying to convince you. It's like 10th grade debate class. They're trying to convince you of a belief and a way of thinking and a philosophy. And so they're going to walk you through what they believe is true, their truth, their particular vision and version of truth. And then we're going to take questions, but we're going to allow equal time. Each person is going to have equal time with each question, and it's going to be fun. It's again, kind of an innovative way of talking about culture, which is what Good&Co does, but it's also allowing for the world to be bigger than just culture. So we're going to be talking about competence as well. So Samar, do me a favor, introduce yourself.
Hey guys, Samar Birwadker. I'm the founder and CEO of Good&Co. Started the company from my couch in 2012. About 2.5 years ago, got acquired by a European behemoth called Axel Springer and Stepstone that's investing heavily in the business. allowing us to grow rapidly.
Very good. Tim, would you please tell the audience about yourself?
Hi, I'm Tim Koirtyohann. None of you will ever be able to spell that if you're not looking at it. I've been doing this in some version or form for about 20 years, both small, medium-sized businesses with a healthy dose of consulting. So I've worn the typical HR generalist hat with a heavy dose of the talent acquisition space. And I currently work around strategic initiatives in that space, including technology, branding, and just general projects related to talent acquisition.
Very nice. And my name is William Tincup, president of RecruitingDaily. And, Google me and you can find me. I don't have much more of an introduction other than, Google. Yo, Google, because Kevin Durant says. All righty, Tim, because you won the coin toss, you get to go first. So I'm going to start the clock right now, and you have the floor, my man.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. That's the traditional opening, isn't it?
It is.
And I just want to say I like tacos. So a vote for me is a vote for tacos. That's what we're about. So I kind of wanted to start here because, everybody loves kittens and I want to win this thing. So I brought a kitten along. There's obviously an equilibrium between the measures of the culture access and the measures of the skill access. We don't want people who don't believe in our organizational values or mission, but we don't want incompetent people. The question then is going to be, what's the right balance given a choice, which is the right area for you to emphasize within your own organization? Another part may be the role culture plays in your go-to-market strategy. How important is your true culture in that mix? And finally, what's the level of available labor to choose between in your given market, and as well as your budget to put in time and energy towards those things? So you really have to think of it in those terms. And I want to start by, really making sure we define competent properly. The traditional definition is more than merely qualified. We're not talking about people that are just bona fide occupationally qualified. We're talking about competencies, and competencies are those knowledge, skills, and abilities of highly successful incumbents that you've measured that you can prove will lead to high potential success, high potential likelihood of success. So when we're talking about hiring for competencies, we're talking about hiring high potential people, not just qualified people. Let's see, if you grab the next slide for me real quick. When we focus too much on culture, this is what we end up with, right? And for this argument, obviously, we're going to concede that we're not talking about protected class concerns. We can all rightly express concerns about culture as a buzzword for discrimination. That's not what we're here to talk about today. We can also rightly express that there are cultures that include an openness to diversity. We can see that hopefully in a growing trend today. I believe that's a lot of that discussion is going on. So let's agree what we're talking about is a healthy focus on cultural fit within the average organization, right? So can we even really define culture appropriately? In the next slide, we can kind of talk about what we tell people our culture is, right? That's kind of the what we sell people versus what the reality of what they experience is. We tend to bring people in and tell them our culture is this big, wonderful culture, but really it's work, right? There's a reason we call it work instead of vacation. And so where do we even begin to measure culture when we talk about hiring for cultural fit? Are we going to hire it based on cultural fit for the company level? Are we going to do it for the division level? What about the department or even the team? What happens too often when these aren't even aligned? And can you say within your organization that your team culture is fully aligned with all those different levels all the way up to the company level? My guess is most of you that if you even went out there and asked what the culture is, you'd get 5 different answers if you asked 4 different people. So, and unlike national cultures, which tend to change slowly over time, organizational cultures change quickly through changes in leaderships, through mergers and acquisitions that are happening. Depending on your industry, there's a lot of consolidation going on, right? So what happens when this company that you've hired for the culture gets snapped up by a different culture, right? So focusing too much on culture is a concern. And then we throw in the impacts of growing technology and the amount of data and information and things that are impacting our culture quickly, right? So if you could pop to the next one, I went out and I looked at, if I Googled someone with cultural manager, I got 16 million. It's like they're the chiropractors of the HR world, except there's more of them, right? We can all do this culture stuff, and yet, what does that really mean? When someone says they're the culture manager, can you really manage a culture, right? A lot of that's happening organically. So, if you would pop to the next one, I mean, let's face it, most of you don't have a grip on your culture. Most of them aren't organized, and your culture probably sucks. But don't worry, because there's 13 million people on LinkedIn that are happy to help you change it. Just go in and type cultural change or change manager, and boom, you'll have 13 million people to pick from. So, so one of the things I would argue in this is it's impacted by your training budget. How many of you really have a training budget to go hire people to fit your culture, whatever that is, at whatever level you're doing it, and have the time and the money to go make that happen? And so my next slide kind of talks about that. It's like, where are you going to get this money, right? Your training budget is how much? I mean, I don't know about y'all's, but our training budget's pretty extensive, and it's still not enough to go out and hire enough people to keep up with every day and have them on your payroll producing minimally till you can get them to the point that we would consider them highly competent employees and high potential people. And of course, we should be investing in them, but we need to hire people that can hit the ground running. That's part of what we do. On the next slide, we'll talk about it real quick because, armies aren't built overnight. They take time to build, but our stocks are traded in milliseconds, right? So if you're lucky enough to be with a smaller organization that's privately held and can look forward over time and invest this money and wait on the results, good for you. The vast majority of people in the organization need to understand where their bread is buttered, and that's on the value proposition of bringing returns on a stock. And so you may not have that. So are you thinking in the broader terms when we're making these arguments? Because as HR people, we want that seat at the table. And then we need to understand how that all works together. And so my argument will be that honestly, you're better off hiring for competencies. People are less likely to change a group than to be changed by the group. So as groups homogenize over time, they bring with them negative impacts. And these negative impacts become groupthink. They become stifling of creativity. They become unwillingness to speak up due to the strength of identity. And so you have people that see things going on, but they don't want to bring it to the table. And the next thing you know, you have a challenger exploding over the United States because someone didn't want to say, hey, wait a minute, that shouldn't work at that temperature, right? So at this extreme, we can see the negative impacts of homogenization and overemphasis of cultures in companies like Enron. We see it through hazing in school, growing nationalism, political tribalism here at home. So why would you want to catalyze organic homogenization by actively making it the basis of your hiring over people that are competent and likely to help you? It's like purging because you want to eat more. This doesn't make sense. In fact, I would argue we often see that companies like Uber and the Dallas Mavericks are hiring competent people to come in and actually break up their culture. So we see people that have hired for culture, and they go, oh, wait a minute, we need to change our culture. So therefore, I would argue we should hire competent people who are sufficiently open to the norms and the values and the mission of our organization as to be accepted over time. And it won't always be easy. You won't always get it. So the focus of de minimis ability to be accepted by the group allows us to bring in fresh ideas and challenges. This means they'll be more likely to be sufficiently unlike the group to be willing to maybe stand up or even walk away. And I would argue if we were smart in questioning ourselves, we actually gain more when people leave our group than what we gain by just making faster homogeny. Because if we ask ourselves why they left, then we can start to address it. So that's kind of my overarching emphasis. And I'll just leave you with this before I hand it off. Companies don't have, people don't leave companies, they leave leaders, they leave managers. But companies have cultures and leaders have competencies. So with that, I ain't got nothing but my cute puppies.
And tacos, evidently. So, Samar, before we get to your case, which you're going to have your case just coming up. Any quick retort that you would like to kind of have for Tim?
I think Tim's gonna eat dirt by the end of this.
Okay, all righty.
Calling Good&Co. But no, to be honest, I think most of Tim's description of problems are absolutely right. Those problems exist. But it just so happens that there is a lot of evidence from our own data that shows that culture isn't like a fluffy Kool-Aid candy floss stuff, right? And yeah, it does lack a common definition. And frankly, that's what we're building at Good&Co, but without plugging Good&Co. I think we're now at a point where we can use so much better technology and smarter technology to engage people, and through people build people analytics. So culture, I think, is sort of a bad, dirty word, and I get why, because there's like 16 million of those people trying to help you out on LinkedIn, right? And I totally agree. But even Tim mentioned at the end that hire confident people. How do you figure out who's confident, Tim? Through their resume? Or is it fake confidence or not?
Okay. All right. Good retort. All right, Clark. Clock is now starting.
Okay.
Samar, you have the floor. Take it and run with it, brother.
All right. So since I'm tackling this like 30-word culture and it's supposed to be fluffy, I thought I'd start with the fluffy story in a way. I'll promise you it ended well, but my journey kind of started in 2012 when I took up this new job at an agency that many people would kill to work for in San Francisco. I was really pumped. Next slide. I couldn't wait to start this Mad Men-esque adventure in a way. Like men in sharp suits doing important things. I was super stoked about it. I didn't have a recruiting or HR background, but it was obviously like a big, important career move for me. Next slide. But the reality ended up feeling a lot more like Office Space, right? Unfortunately, like the whole shtick with Mr. Lumberg and his TPS reports, the reality is I actually really liked the work, but the culture felt stifling. And I realized that it's more about the people that I work with day in and day out, not about sort of the company culture, right? And it's the people that actually affect my happiness, my learning, fulfillment, all of those things. And I realized there was no way for me to figure out what it was going to be like working with this team or having the tools to be able to work with them better. And I realized that team was becoming the core currency of operations going forward. Next slide. And I also realized that it wasn't just a personal problem. People were joining companies like Tim said earlier, but they were really leaving teams and managers. In fact, managers were the one variable we identified in our own research that had the largest impact on any individual success. And I realized that it was bigger, it was getting worse, and nobody was trying to fix it from the bottom up. And like Tim mentioned earlier, there is no common definition of culture. Is a one-person wellness consultant going to come fix your culture? Probably not. Is next slide, please. Is like free ping pong tables and free lunches and shuttle buses your culture? Definitely not. I mean, that's probably an extension, tactical extension or manifestation of your culture. But culture is really defined by the people you work with day in and day out. After all, we spend a third of our lives at work, right? And we owe it to ourselves to love what we do. Next slide. So when I started thinking about this and I realized, yeah, I looked at Glassdoor reviews, it all looked great, or people just had bad experiences with the company. So I feel like people on both ends of the extreme end up painting the culture of the company instead of understanding what's going to be in real life working with them. Also, when I started doing more research, I found out that we're in the middle of a perfect storm. We're spending more money today than we've ever before in hiring new people, but we're also losing them more quickly than ever before. Even though leaders say that culture is the top factor, the top challenges facing human capital in the future, most of them rate it very urgent, but we're actually not putting our money where our mouth is. Next slide. And millennials truly are changing the nature of workplace. In fact, their expectations of workplace are significantly different than the generation before. And yeah, every generation complains about the next generation, that they wear weird clothes or listen to weird music or they have bad taste. And that's fine. But the only big difference is that the internet has really made these changes at a steroidal pace than ever before. And in fact, millennials are so different about their attitude towards work. Often they get a bad rap, but really they're looking for a more holistic or shared sense of beliefs and motivations and values between the personal and professional lives. And when they do find that, they outperform anyone else because they want to believe in something bigger, something more purposeful, have a greater sense of meaning. And yeah, we can call it like the fluffy stuff, but they don't want to be like our fathers who punched in and clocked out from 9 to 5. And as you can see here, there's a lot of data that suggests that millennials literally do think differently, and 40% of our workforce is going to be millennials in the next 2 years. Next slide. And talent management itself is going through a pretty big transformation. I mean, that's the evolution over the decades, where now it's about quantifying people's soft skills and soft factors. And even though culture sounds fluffy when you talk to a consultant about it, but the reality is we have so much amazing technology handy these days that we can actually quantify it, build a common definition for it, and use it as a predictive model to increase the predictability of someone's success in a unique organization. When I say organization culture, it's not about the overall organization. Frankly, there are some traits that are common across multiple organizations. Next slide, please. But really, it boils down to sort of the experiences you have in the microcultures in the organization. And organizations are nothing but a collection of microcultures. Next slide.
Just 1 second, because like I said, technical difficulties.
I can keep talking. And
Keep talking.
Yeah.
So the slide that you're not seeing right now gives you a sense of how teams used to be distributed, very hierarchical, top down, and that's how they were, right? And then in the middle is a diagram that shows that we're sort of in this ambiguous phase right now before we end up at a more crystallized place where things work differently, where there's more shared values and culture, transparent goals and projects, and people are rewarded for their skills and abilities, not position. And basically, organizations end up being little microcultures that are actually quantifiable because those microcultures have the unique traits and values. And yes, competency is obviously important because you can't like hire a Java engineer who doesn't know how to code in Java. But really, like what separates a Java engineer from the 200 other Java engineers that are within 2 miles of you? And in San Francisco, there's probably 2,000 within 2 miles of you, right? So how we need a different layer of data to fix the problem of losing people more quickly and not investing in their training. And that's the one thing I do agree with Tim on, like training is critical. In fact, it's easier to hire someone for fit and train them than it is to sort of like only look for people like a needle in a haystack with specific skills. Are we at the slide where it says unlocking the power of social capital on teams? I think it's further up. Further up. Anyways, I'll keep talking. It says unlocking the power of social capital. And one other realization I had from our own data and my research was that we've moved, like our social capital is really not about the physical capital that it used to be, or human capital. It's really about our culture, relationships, knowledge sharing. For example, if you can call someone a good friend at work, you tend to stay twice as long and are twice more productive, right? And these are things that matter now. And in the past, it used to be like a bunch of people on a team interviewing the same person, but all bring the bias into the equation. So it's not people in a biased way, even subconsciously, end up hiring people that look like them, talk like them, act like them. But the reality is everyone's going to look at it differently based on your personality traits and your background. Go to the next slide, please. So frankly, just to close the loop on that story, that's when I realized that this wasn't just a personal problem, that people were joining companies but leaving teams and managers. The social and economic cost of this was just too great to ignore. It was bigger than me and it was getting worse, and nobody was trying to fix it from the bottom up. So we set out to build a common definition and a quantifiable framework for what culture means and how it's different from each other in teams. Next slide. And I won't bore you with the Good Co plug, but what's interesting to me, what you'll see on the slide is just because perhaps our background wasn't originally in HR and recruiting, we wanted to solve for the people problem, helping people discover themselves, become more self-aware through fun quizzes. And we've been described in a bunch of different ways in the press, like eHarmony meets LinkedIn, or like a Myers-Briggs for the 21st century, or like a more quantified, predictable Glassdoor, if you will. And I think all of them are the same thing, but then if you go to the next slide, what we've really done, and based on what Tim was saying earlier, and really solving for, frankly, and that we haven't connected on this content before, I swear, but I know I'm hoping that it's answering some of Tim's concerns, but that's really what we set out to do, build a common definition of culture that's quantifiable, predictive, it's employee first, where people love using it, it's viral, that grows within your company, but more importantly, the quantitative framework works on scale. And basically, just over the years, we built this really fun viral employee first model that has grown to like over 3 million users, 100 plus million psychometric data points captured, and we bottom up decoded the culture to about 10,000 companies. Next slide. The next slide, which says bros before cores. And then our own research shows us a lot based on the data that we've gathered from all our users, is that when there's a good culture fit, employees are a third less likely to quit. They're 3x more productive with a high culture match. We're losing billions of dollars every year because of lost productivity, and a lot of that is very, very highly correlated with not getting along with your immediate team. 9 out of 10 hiring failure is due to poor culture fit, and at least 2/3 of Americans are disengaged at work, and that's primarily because of not having a friend at work or a bad culture fit. Next slide. So, and traditional hiring is imperfect. Like the internet has changed our world far too quickly. On the one hand, it's solved the problem of sourcing because it's become so easy to apply. It's like one click apply. But we can't make those decisions just based on what people are saying in their resumes anymore, outside of like actual skill testing, right? We need another layer of data that adds more confidence, adds more predictability. Even if we do like 20% better, like we're saving billions of dollars given how poorly we're doing right now. But being able to predict someone's likelihood of success on a specific team, not just an overall company culture. So what I'm trying to say is that it boils down to the micro cultures on teams, and teams are basically just a collection of people. More importantly, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Just because you have competence, it doesn't guarantee performance. In fact, there's a ton of research that shows that your skills or your past job or the school you went to have very low correlation with the other criteria, which is success at work. What really has high correlation is quote unquote how you get along with your immediate team, but more importantly, your hiring manager. But how the hell do you quantify that? But you got to build systems that become part of the DNA of the organization that your employees use, and it's still fun, but they get a lot of value and insights from it that you can then use to make better hires that are scientifically culture fit to your team, not just the overall company culture, because that's kind of vague. Next, last slide. So in summary, here's what I'll say. people join companies, but they leave in teams and managers. And I know Tim will totally agree with me on that. But each team is unique. Their cultures can be very different. A marketing manager in team A could look like a successful marketing manager on team A could look very different on team B because they're now interacting with a completely different group of people, right? We can't rely on functional resume data anymore. Cultures kind of become an excuse for bias. That's because we haven't done ourselves a favor by making it such a soft and fluffy thing. In fact, I don't even want to call it culture anymore. Culture isn't static. It grows and evolves based on people that join and leave companies, and especially teams. It's actually quantifiable, it's predictive, and it can be performance driven. And frankly, that's your most defensible asset because it's your internal brand and external brand due to the internet's transparency. It's now all become one and the same. So that's my last bit.
That's it. All righty. Now, Tim, Samar went a little long, but we had trouble with slides. So some of that was actually technical difficulty and him filling a little bit of time. You've listened to his case. What's the first thing that comes to your mind, or what's a retort that you have?
Well, I would go back to, I'm glad that we agree that people don't leave companies, they leave leaders, and leaders, of course, are comprised of competencies. In fact, I would argue that much of what makes a culture breaks down to competencies. If you have a customer service culture, it requires customer service competencies first. So, Samar made the interesting point of how do you hire more competent people? And to me, that's a great question, right? So the issue isn't really stopping hiring for competency and hiring for culture. It's the best way to identify competencies. And I could see a fit for a tool like Good&Co's tool. It's very similar to one I've seen. I'm sure there's some market differences, but when we would work with this tool and our internal customers, our hiring managers and new hires, it's about not finding a square peg for a square hole, but knowing that you're always going to have to manage people. And so if I put a stop sign over top of a square, I'm going to have those gaps. How can I use that tool to identify those gaps and put them in a situation where they're not the perfect fit so that I can bring that external person into the group? And I would ask Samar, do you feel that's a value proposition for a manager to be able to use the tool to bring somebody from outside the group who may not be the perfect fit?
In fact,
and there you go.
The problem with culture is that it's kind of become an excuse for discrimination. And even if people don't do it consciously, they do it subconsciously. And the reality is that you can't just make a blanket statement that we need to hire for confidence, right? Or competence. Because here's the thing, it's about how the best teams come together is people bring in very varied perspectives. But if you talk about customer support, you know what's really important for customer support from our own research of we're literally millions of data points? Empathy. How would you know if someone's empathetic or not? Because if someone's empathetic and really cares about solving other people's problems or has a motivation to solve problems, depending on the product and the category, that customer service representative could look very, very different, right? But how do you actually gauge that outside of every person on your team spending hours of their very expensive time interviewing them, but still coming to the discussion with different viewpoints because we don't have a common language for culture?
All right, we've got a bunch of questions to get asked here, so I'm gonna direct a couple of questions. And first, Tim, I'm going to ask you, how do you define competency metrics? First of all, I won't even assume that there are competency metrics, but we are kind of becoming more and more of a data-driven world, data-driven HR and recruiting. How do you define competency from an analytical or metrics perspective? And Samar, I'll ask you the same thing about culture.
So I would start with, every job has a job description, and you should have clear objectives and metrics around the performance of the job. So from there, it's looking at what are the people doing that help them be most successful in meeting those metrics. What are the soft skills? Because those do play a role in it. Okay. So, if your metric is call time, what are they doing in there to make that call time go smoothly with a positive customer experience? I'm a data hound. I love data, but I always try to say there is no perfect data. So take the best data you can get, use it consistent, and make it for the starting point for your conversation. But I believe that you can use that data to scale or scaffold upward and downward from what it is you're doing and what it is you're measuring to identify the competencies. Just like someone that plays golf knows that to hit par, they need 2 putts. So what do I got to do to get 2 putts? Well, I got to hit the fairway, because if I hit the fairway, I'm more likely to be to the green in regulation. And if I'm on the green in regulation, I have 2 putts, I'm most likely to make par.
Nice. Samar, first of all, before I do that, folks, chime in with questions. There's already been about 8 or 10 come in, but please get your questions in. You can also get them in over Twitter and just use the hashtag #RDaily, and we'll look at them there. Samar, same question, but about culture. What are the metrics of culture? What are people asking? How are they defending their purchase, etc.?
Yeah. So one thing I do agree with Tim on is that there's no perfect data, and especially in the case of culture, right? I mean, we're trying to decode, quantify people. People are really complex. We hold 2 opposing ideas in our mind at the same time, and that's a gift, right? And the thing is, it's not about decoding people, but the things that you can quantify in their values, their attitudes, you should, because you want to use that data to make better decisions. And that's another way or another dimension of data that layers in to improving your predictability of whether someone's going to work out, or how do you get someone to work well with the team. So the lens with which I look at and Good&Co looks at is teams, because teams is really where it's at. And the best teams really come together, not because people know each other's strengths, but they can work to each other's weaknesses, right? And that's sort of the camaraderie and bond that builds over time. And in Good&Co's case, and this is not a plug for Good&Co, but that's something we identified early on and what Tim pointed out, right? Because teams are evolving and changing, and they're just a collection of the people on there. So for example, in Good&Co, each person based on their strong traits plays a specific role on the team. Someone could be a Zen master, or someone could be like the conscience of the team, someone could be an analyst. And then when you can simulate adding someone to the team, depending on that person's traits, those roles might shift. And then it like pops up these warning signs to the manager, like watch out for this or watch out for that. But the reality is that it's not, because it's actually the opposite. It's not about hiring cookie cutter examples of each other. It's actually building the best dream team together that will have the most collaborative sort of agreements, but also the right kind of disagreements, enough commonalities, but also enough differences. And that's all dependent on the category, the function, the role. Like you probably want something different in design and engineering, but it could look very different in customer support or like front office at the Hyatt.
Okay. Tim, question for you. Most critical positions. So we could call these high performers, high potentials, top talent, A talent, however we want to say it. Let's just say it's CEO, if you want to kind of go there. Do you feel differently? Do you feel differently about your argument in terms of competence over culture?
No, I think it's even more important, because if at the highest level, they may be brought in to change the culture or break up the culture or to move the organization in a different direction. When you're having change at those high levels, you first got to ask, why are we bringing this person in? I would argue that, we gain the most by having an opt-in approach to culture, right? So realistic job descriptions, realistic job previews, where during the interview, we talk about these things, we talk about where we're going. If it's not aligned, they won't join, right? So by the time you get through that conversation and you've moved that ball down, you're starting to deal with someone that's already at least aligned and sufficient, and you feel comfortable enough will fit in the group, that you're bringing in a thought leader to say, hey, maybe we need to do things differently. And I would argue there, the competencies of knowing how to make something change within an organization to take you to market quicker, to get better results, to increase profitability, to make workers feel like they're contributing to the success of the organization. Those are competencies you need. And that if you do it correctly in the interview process, you will position it to where people that don't align with you just won't show up. And that's
Right.
why the research is clear that realistic job previews tend to have at least a 12-month ability to move that short-term turnover out.
So what's interesting is you did make an assumption in there, and that I want to highlight that to the audience, that there's a lot of honesty. So you've one of the assumptions you've made in that is that recruiters and hiring managers are going to give a true depiction of what's really behind the veil. They're going to be very probably overtly honest about that. So I just leave that as a caveat to what you said. Samar, same question. Top talent, critical, most critical talent. These are people in the succession plan.
Mhm.
You know, these are the hard to find, most
Yeah.
critical positions. We could even call them the CEO if you want, if that's helpful. Does it change your mind any? Does it change your direction any in terms of culture being more important than competence?
Well, very slightly, but it does in some ways, because at that level you can compromise on just the number of years of experience or how many times you've actually made mistakes, because you don't want to pay for everyone's first mistakes at that critical role, right? So competency does take on a greater role, but even then, culture is just as important. They're both equally important, because if you really think about it, it's more about this is the person that's going to actually build a foundation, actually set the tone, build a purpose for the company. But just because you have a fluffy statement on top doesn't mean it's actually going to happen, right? You got to turn it into tactics to your teams and your immediate teams, and empower your managers to focus on being better managers, instead of like focusing on being better just in their craft. So it does change, like the focus does become more on competence, but more importantly, also number of years of experience. We can also extrapolate that and identify that more years of experience, more mistakes you've made, builds more empathy in you. And that's a very strong trait that leaders need to have, to actually be able to empathize with someone. And if someone's just approaching it as a science with a right or wrong answer, that's just not how companies get run. So you need to have someone that's actually able to deal with ambiguity, empathize, and then translate the purpose into tactical strategies that their people can act on.
Okay, good. Next question is going to be kind of tough. So just kind of get prepared for this. The question is a Me Too question. Hashtag Me Too. What is our generation's 9/11 or John F. Kennedy or Man on the Moon, however you want to phrase it? These stories that have coming out, and all the stories that haven't come out yet. Is the failure is that failure of Me Too, that these stories are just now coming out? Is that about competency or culture? I'll throw it to you, Tim.
Oh gosh. You know, as someone raised by a strong mother, and what a day to say that. And having two daughters and a wife that's in the workforce, you know, this is a big issue, and I think we cannot get around the cultural impacts of it. I don't know where that the competencies have that much to do with it as much as our societal norms and
So
our
let me
organizational norms.
let me push you a little bit there. Harvey Weinstein, successful executive producer of Miramax, put out probably some of the greatest movies in the 90s. He got there with competence, right? Ultimately, or at least he was protected by competence. So, did he create a culture that allowed these things to happen because of his success or because of his competence? Like it is chicken and egg. The whole thing we're
I can take
talking
that,
about.
Tim.
Okay, go ahead, bring it.
So I think this is a great question. Like seriously, and we see this especially in the Bay Area all the time, right? We say that we are actually creating equality and equal pay in the workforce for males versus females. That doesn't show in the data. It just doesn't, right? And I really do think this is a cultural problem, not because I'm representing culture right now. The one thing that I do really agree with Tim on, if you've had a positive role model that's a woman in your life, that changes your outlook, because then you empathize more with women. And like Harvey Weinstein, right? It's, I think, boils down to our sort of culture as maybe even a country, but especially in these little bubbles within a bubble, whether it's Hollywood or whether it's Silicon Valley, right? Is the culture of celebrating power and success at any cost. No matter how you get there, it doesn't matter, right? But it's more about if you're powerful, you can get away with shit. If you are successful, you deserve it because you worked hard. And that's where just single-minded looking at competency is a very flawed way of looking at it. It's really about empathy and training people to be more empathetic with others' problems around you, and especially in the male to female issue that we're facing, and the difference in pay in wages, and difference in like promotions and the glass ceiling and all of that stuff. I think it's really like a boys club culture, which is to be blamed for, and that's part of probably our evolution as in the economy and the way we've evolved, or more historical or more DNA based, but that exists. And I think the only way to change it is to build sensitivity and empathy, and that comes naturally if you've had a positive female role model in your life.
All right. Next question.
Yeah, I want to build on that. I want to build on that for 1 second, because I think to answer your question, I think that it was the culture that permitted it, and it's a culture where money and results matter more than humans. And we need to all work on that in all aspects of our lives.
Okay.
So I don't know that it was his competencies that allowed him to create that culture. I think he inherited it and he leveraged it, and it was wrong. And we've got to do more as a group. So
good. All right. Next question. So I'm gonna take 3 different places: Manhattan, Silicon Valley, and Wichita, Kansas. Okay, 3 different places. You've probably been to all 3, hopefully. Is culture or competence different in any of those 3 places? Tim, I'm going to want to talk to you about it first. So imagine yourself as a recruiter, in the Valley, in Manhattan, or Wall Street, if you want to go that specific, and in Wichita, Kansas, in some type of little manufacturing play. Does that change your mind about competence or culture?
No. And I would just want to say I was glad you clarified, because I was going, man, Manhattan's like right down the road from Wichita. No, I mean, obviously we have to have people that are going to be aligned on some level of acceptability with shared vision, mission, values, and certain other aspects, right? And even Mr. Haney and Mr. Douglas got along in Green Acres, and that Arnold Ziffel, what an actor. So you can take people. I mean, we have to, as leaders, we have to build those bridges within our organization to allow those competent people who are aligned well enough to go in and manage, and using something like Good&Co as a tool to say, hey, here's some things that we can work on, and here's how to better understand this person, and use it as a tool to bring competencies in and make them fit within the culture better is where I see a great value proposition. But we shouldn't go, oh, well, you're from the sticks, so you're not going to make it in the city, or well, you're just a city boy. The best of us that are recruiting, when we go certain places, we may dress a little differently. I guarantee you, I wore my boots today out to a meeting I had with some new employees. So I'm fit in, but that doesn't mean that I wear my boots every day.
Right. Samar, similar question, same question actually. Again, you're in the Valley, you're in the bubble within the bubble within the other bubble, but you've been to Wall Street enough times. You might not have been to Wichita, Kansas, but we'll throw that in there.
I have actually, but
okay. Does it change your perspective at all?
It does. Well, it doesn't change what I believe is there's multiple factors that layer in to that affect sort of culture and differences. And really, based on our own data, we see people's job roles, even if they're at the same level in different cities, there's different traits that make them successful. Like, we see a strong correlation with that. But if we're talking about geography, the history of the place, or even the local economics, whether it's a manufacturing town, a university town, like all those things layer in. And they're all cultural aspects. But then there's also things like category, right? Do you work in aviation, or do you work in like healthcare, or the job function, if you're in design, or you're in customer support, or you're a business analyst, and the level of seniority that indicates how much empathy you have or psychological safety you have. But there's also this existing dynamics that you walk into. right? Like the group, if it's a boys club, or if it's more of like an empowering place that does yoga every morning, what have you. And I think all of those factors layer in, but there's definitely correlation with, even if it's the same job role at the same level in different cities, could require you to have a certain attitude. Like in Silicon Valley, you do want some of that, like forward thinking, making mistakes is okay, celebrating failure approach, and you don't have to do things exactly by the book all the time, because we celebrate that in Silicon Valley. But on the other hand, we spent a lot of time in San Antonio when we went to Techstars many years ago, and I'm so glad we did that, right? Because we were a San Francisco company that was living in our echo chamber, which is like a bubble within a bubble within a bubble, in a way, right? Um, and we're building for each other, and then spending a few months in Texas, in the mainland, like really builds empathy with what your real customers are, and that made a huge impact on the culture of our company. And Texas is still in some ways embedded in us in one way or the other. And USA is a company in San Antonio, which is very militaristic, obviously, right? They have very tough policies, like you check clock in, clock out when you go to the bathroom. Like there's all these different rules, but you know what? Their levels of engagement with their employees, their tenure is some of the best in the country. It's because they've done a really good job of attracting the right kind of people that'll thrive in their unique culture. And you can't tell that by resume and competency anymore.
Right, right. All right, so we got about 4 or 5 minutes left. This is the time in the debate where you have your kind of final shots. So, Tim, I want to start with you and let Samar have the last word. You know, go out strong. You're making the case for competency over culture. What's the things that you really want people to know?
So when I was a little kid, speaking of my mom, who's had a rough week this week, so keep her in your thoughts, please. We used to go to the Fort Worth and Science and History Museum, and we would go up the stairs, and there was the history of medicine, right? And there'd be this big diorama. There'd be some cavemen, and they're all around the cave fire. And there's one kind of laid out, and the rest are standing over him. One of them's kneeling, and one of them's obviously a witch doctor, and he's holding this big rock. And you look down at the one laying on the ground, and his head is split wide open, showing part of his brain. I would argue that witch doctor, caveman guy, he was pretty aligned with the culture. He's the kind of guy that fit right in. In fact, he was a cultural leader within that organization. The problem is he lacked a little bit in the competency of brain surgery. And so as we move forward through these, it's obviously a bell curve. And I think there is a great place for a tool like Samar and his team's tool to help you identify where people, fall on that bell curve of, do they fit within the ranges of the culture that we need for them to be successful in this group, but also not a square peg, and be able to adapt and give them the tools that we can talk to them about, hey, here's how you can communicate with Jane better, right? Here's how you can soften over here. Maybe you need to be a little bit more empathetic. How do we as leaders manage and lead people, right? That's why we're in those roles, not because it's easy, but because we go out and we take the people who can be highly successful and we move them and make them better. And I see the tool being a useful way around that. Use it to manage communications and develop your people instead of excluding people. And I think the best recruiters and talent acquisition people find ways to include successful people, not exclude them.
Yep.
Alrighty. Samar?
Yeah.
Parting shots, brother.
Yeah. So I think that whole witch doctor analogy, dude, you took it too far. I mean, I see the point you're trying to make, but that's sort of an extreme example, right? Like, you're not going to hire someone as a rocket scientist who's only worked in food service industry before, right? So that's sort of an extreme example. But here's what I'd say. I think we sometimes overcomplicate things, and maybe, like, I'm obsessed with just boiling things down into its most basic variable. I think people want 3 things to be successful and happy at work. They want a competitive paycheck. They want to be challenged, and they want to work with people that they get along with or learn something from. And that's it, right? If you can get 2.5 of those things right, you've already, like, way ahead of the curve. And the thing is, for all our companies, right, the largest line item is people. right? But it's a shame that it's also the least sophisticated in our approach. Like, we leave so much about people and their attitude and personality and their approach to chance. We would never do that with the more quantifiable part of our business, right? And I think the future, the next 30 years, and there's a lot of research that suggests that, is really going to hinge on our ability to better quantify human capital and be able to use that in more effective ways to help people build happier, more fulfilling lives. And obviously, culture is not effective at all if it's just a fluffy, like phrase wrote on the wall. And it is the leader's responsibility, and it's a leader's initiative that you turn those hollow words into tactical output and tactical tasks for your team by focusing on your managers and empowering them to do the same and build their own flavor of culture and competency in their teams. And I think without that, I think we are ourselves responsible for turning culture into such a fluffy, ambiguous word. But I think our industry and the tools we built haven't allowed us to use that in a way that nurtures and builds our culture in a competitive, performance-driven way, right? But I think that can change.
That's it, ladies and gentlemen. That's the debate. That is the end of the debate. We've got like 30 seconds left. First of all, I want to thank both Tim and Samar for taking the polar opposites. I think both gentlemen could probably argue both sides of this clearly. But I do want to thank both of them for coming on and kind of taking a position and really running with it. I want to thank Good&Co for sponsoring this and allowing us just to do something different and have a debate. I also want to thank the audience for showing up and hanging out with us and allowing us to kind of put this debate in front of you. As Lex would say, the webinar will be live, and we'll send you a link, and then within 24 hours. But I want everyone to have a great afternoon, and we're out of here. Thank you all very much.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And only one of us brought you puppies and kittens.
So you go with competence now.
That's right.
Well, so much for competence and data, right?
That's right. Puppies and kittens.
Puppies and kittens. Thanks again, everyone. Appreciate you.
Thank you.